Sweet. All right, great. So, yeah, talk about Fadens, kind of an odd thing in the mineral realm. Even though I don't know, maybe Ed doesn't think so because there are no mineral oddities. I'm excited to hear why that is. So my journey with Faden started when I started at Mines back in 2019. There was a couple other students who had been working for another mineral dealer, Dudley Blowett and Jeff Nickel, and they were like, anybody want to drive a van down to Tucson and help with the mineral show? And I was like, why not? And in unpacking all of these beautiful Pakistani treasures, I was just enamored and immediately sold and had to have all of them. And so several years later, here we are. Like Ann said, I also collect apatite group minerals and siderite, both of which occur as Fadens. Maybe siderite's debatable because you can't really see the Faden, but they occur in these environments, and so it's quite nice for me from my collecting point of view. It kind of all coalesced around these weird habits. So I'm gonna give a brief background on like how we got to current thinking on Fadens. Disclosure, similar to Aaron, I do not speak German or Russian, so there's probably some gaps in my knowledge, unfortunately. Slowly working on that. But one of the first descriptions of Fadens was by a naturalist named Scharf back in 1846. Of course, his observations weren't entirely correct, but I think we can forgive him for it being 1864. But the first generally accepted quote unquote correct description, and that being that these are formed in very active tectonic settings, and that's directly reflected in the crystals, was by a paper by Lamlin in 1946, which was subsequently translated into German in 72. That made this idea of Fadens much more accessible to both the German-speaking and some of the French-speaking population. There was the abstract in this was in French, and after that there was another publication by Reichardt, which kind of like further elaborated on some of these ideas, and that brings us to the Pete Richards article in 1990 and the MinRec, which is now kind of like one of the articles on Faden development, where Pete proposes the two-stage growth hypothesis, wherein you have this initial growth of likely maybe fibrous minerals, and then subsequent growth around that, around those fibers. And then additionally, we have some newer contributions by Cantor, who give some additional commentary on the crystal growth and propose a slightly different model where instead of this fibrous initial growth, you have this repeated growth of the crystal, and then as the fissure widens, you have breakage, and so on and so forth. And then lastly, there's a great article by Carl Francis in 2023 that it's a connoisseur's choice article, so some absolutely fantastic images, and then gives an overview on the concepts, as well as some more modern localities that were not necessarily described in the Pete Richards article in 1990. So let's I'm just going to jump in here with some figures from the MinRec article from Pete Richards. So this is the general idea, or his general idea for how these are developing. You have this fissure opening up in these very active tectonic settings. I guess I should put these up here first. So that's generally where we find these. They're in these what are quote unquote alpine cleft environments, majority of the time, not always, as we now know. And I mean, these environments have intense lateral stress. I mean, these are mountain building events, so you're going to have stresses in a number of different orientations, and you're obviously going to be creating these cracks, which are going to well, inevitably have minerals form in them, as we often do. And so what Richards was proposing in his article was that you first, as these cracks open, you're going to have this initial, what we now know as the Faden line. He's proposing that will form and stretch and continue to grow, and then afterwards you have subsequent mineral growth that forms the majority of the macro crystal, the lovely quartz crystals that we see nowadays. And just as a note, the word Faden actually directly translates from the German thread, which is when you look at a fantastic example and you just say, yeah, that's a thread. Yeah, that tracks. And if we want to take a close-up well, I do want to take a close-up look at a Faden, and this is also from Richard's article in 1990. We can see that there's a number of fluid and gas inclusions that trail along the entire length of the Faden. We also see that these they're more or less in these parallel they're more or less parallel to each other. As you follow the Faden line, you can see like all of these little assemblages are more or less parallel to each other and appear to be growing in more of like a stepwise fashion. And this, as we know, there's this repeated breakage and rehealing, and that is likely reflected in these fluid inclusions. That is, I should say, that is what is being reflected in the fluid inclusions, that you have this growth and then stoppage, but then you again have this continued expansion of the fracture and then more growth. And that at each of those stages, you're going to trap a little bit of the fluid on the surface of the crystal. And this is a lot of what, sorry, I should say, some of what Cantor suggests in their paper. We can also see there's a question maybe about orientation, and maybe something about the orientation of the Faden is helping to control the growth and so on and so forth. But as we very quickly see, and I should state that these arrows on this figure from Minarek article are the orientation of the C-axis of the quartz grain. And we very quickly see from over here in A, the orientation of the Faden is directly parallel to the C-axis, and then we come looking all the way through, and we find that it's all the way, it can be perpendicular and everything in between. So we can see that there's numerous variations on this theme, and that the Faden is not directly controlling the orientation, the crystallographic orientation, I should say, of the quartz grain. It is still obviously controlling some level, or it's involved on some level, the growth of the quartz, but it's not directly affecting the exact orientation. And so, as a Faden collector, one of my first questions was, okay, where the heck do I find more of these? These are incredible. And you have all of these different variations, like I said, not only in quartz, and as we'll get to in a bit, other species, but I want to know, where the heck do I find more of these? And so I first went to Pete Richards' article in 1990, though he does state that this isn't necessarily a comprehensive overview. But we can see that their form, they're pretty well, even in this limited look, we have them from the Swiss Alps and the French Alps, as well as a couple locations in the United States and Canada. But, I was dealing with all of this fantastic Pakistani material, and I was like, all right, well, there's got to be more. And that's all. No, it's not all. It's everywhere. And I mean everywhere, but it's more abundant than we, had initially realized, these Fadens. And so, but let's jump into the Alps first. This is a absolutely fantastic example of a quartz Faden with what Pete described as a mosaic structure. And that's what this is. This specimen, I should say, is from his article, figure 5, I believe, where he talks about the mosaic structure. And actually, what we've come to know now is that the mosaic structure is actually a fundamental feature of a majority of Fadens. You can find individual single crystals where you have just a really well-developed Faden line, just in a single crystal of quartz, but that's actually not the most common way that we find these. This is actually typical of these features, where you have multiple stacked crystals that are, well, more or less following the Faden line. We can look at another example from the Swiss Alps. This is a fantastic, slightly smoky Faden, which is in itself a bit unusual, because typically in the environments that we're forming them in, oh, whoops, I got a little bit ahead of myself. This is a Faden with a little bit of a twist, and I don't mean a gwindle. Those Fadens and gwindles are exclusive of each other. And that's a whole other discussion in and of itself. But what actually we see here is, all these specimens in the slideshow are in the museum. So I would love for people to take a look and look at these beautiful features further. But and this is a little easier to see in person. But there's a small, a little bit of a curvature to this Faden line from this direction. It kind of comes up in this way. But and this is proposed to be a result of a slight twisting of the fissure as it's opening. a lot of times these fissures are not going to be just, completely perfect parallel walls that are moving apart from each other. There is going to be a little bit of twist and a little bit of give as these things open. Nature is fortunately, a little messy. And like I said, a little bit of smoke in this Faden, and now I can talk about why that's unusual. That's unusual because typically we form Fadens in metamorphic terrains. Not always, but mostly. And with some exceptions, of course, there's always exceptions, which is I'm glad for. But this specimen in particular, fantastic example of a Faden in a smoky quartz from Chamonix, Mount Blanc. And in this environment, in Chamonix, we have a higher amount of granites, for example, and that's why we find smoky quartz is the natural radiation from granites. But like I said, typically we're not forming Fadens in environments with a lot of these igneous components, so typically we don't find smoky Fadens. But like I said, always exceptions, always something new. So moving outside of the Alps, that was where we first started to make these observations about Fadens, but not even the most prolific localities as we now know. We can, one fantastic example here in the States is the Stand on Your Head mine, which is just to the northeast, I believe, of the Hot Springs area, which is another, as we all know, hotbed of absolutely fantastic quartz, which also includes some Fadens. This Faden in particular is bizarre to me. It's you can't even see the best part of the Faden line because of the best way to take a picture of the whole specimen. You can't really see it, but it's contained within this section right here. So it's got quite the bend in the Faden ultimately. And it's still a matrix, which is rather rare. Typically, as these pockets are expanding, if they expand enough, a lot of these things will become floaters and they're absolutely perfect floaters. But because of that, you typically don't find them on matrix. But here we do. This one is probably my favorite and probably one of my favorite pieces in my entire collection. The Zab district in Pakistan has been a prolific area in terms of producing Fadens. We now have a little bit more accurate specific location details on this area because the Zab district itself is quite large, and we actually have more specific locality information. But I mean, this is actually a single crystal. And the Faden in this case is aligned with the C-axis of the crystal, and the aspect ratio is just wild. As soon as I saw this, I said, yeah, how can I not? And again, these are all in the case over in the museum. It's always lovely to look at. We move a little bit beyond just quartz. We see that Fadens can even form in uveite. So this is from Brumado, Brazil. The Faden line is a bit hard to see in picture. It's a little easier to see in person, but it's only about 1 centimeter, so it's rather hard. So unless you have a good flashlight and a hand lens, it's a bit tricky. But the observation of Fadens in minerals other than quartz is a fantastic observation. It also means that this is more of this can be a more generalized geologic process that we can start to make more observations about, as opposed to it just being a unique feature of quartz, kind of like what Gwendol's are, at least from what we've observed so far. We also see it in apatites. So this is from Kamale, Pakistan. It's in the Momand district. And we know apatites, they'll often form these lovely flower-like structures in these alpine cleft environments. And they can also form Fadens, which, like I said as earlier, as an apatite collector, I was very happy to find out. Quickly added to my collection. And now I want to, sorry. Oh, sorry. Want to move on to talk a little bit about a specific locality, which is Alchuri, Pakistan, located in the Shigara Valley. And it's kind of become the new standard for Fadens. And not really even for quartz necessarily, though there are some quartz Fadens that occur there, but for the numerous other species that occur as Fadens at Alchuri: orthoclase, epidote, zoisite, and clinozoisite, apatite, and titanite. Just absolutely fantastic examples that are just I mean, not only are they absolutely fantastic Fadens, but they're some of the gemmiest crystals you've ever seen. So you can tell I'm a fan. Now, at Alchuri, calcite occurs. I've not seen a calcite Faden from Alchuri. However, I do want to argue with you about yours later, Terry. I think it is a Faden, but that's beside the point. There are a few other minerals that could be Fadens, like I mentioned earlier, siderite or hematite. But because they're opaque, it kind of comes to a big question of, well, is it a Faden? I mean, the whole origin of that word means a thread, and if you can't see a thread, is it really a Faden? So if somebody wants to cut open a really nice looking siderite Faden at some point, then be my guest. But until then, I think we can just kind of say that's a really nice siderite. Some more images of other species from Alchuri, some absolutely fantastic Fadens. So this is a orthoclase Faden over here, about 4 centimeters long with honestly, one of the nicest actinolite crystals I've ever seen, just kind of hanging out in direct contact. Can't really see a Faden in there, but it wouldn't surprise me if there was just a little bit. And then also apatite Faden that I looked at several times in Dudley's collection. I think he had like $10 on it. And finally I was like, why has no one bought this? And then I was like, why haven't I bought this? And so now it's in my collection. It's actually very interesting. The end of it is I don't think it's broken. I think it just terminated on another face and then popped off and then rehealed a little bit. But you can actually see into the apatite Faden a little bit, which is rather interesting because one of the other areas that has Fadens that apatite Fadens being the Sapo mine, those are actually now completely hollow on the inside. So just an interesting feature that I've observed more than once in apatite Fadens specifically. Now, so like I said, or like Ian mentioned, I'm an exploration geologist, so I spend a lot of time in the Nevada desert thinking, which good or bad, I don't know. But I think a lot about, processes. The modern exploration technique now is not to just say, hey, there's a little bit of gold over there, let's sink a hole. It's more about looking at these as ore deposits as larger processes. And one of my favorite papers is this one by Jeremy Richards, different Richards from previously, that's Pete Richards. Giant ore deposits formed by optimal alignments and combinations of geological processes. And so this puts the idea of ore deposits, I'll get back to Fadens in just a second, in more of a process-driven perspective. And it's more about these alignments of geologic processes. And I would actually assert the same thing for Fadens. I would say that these are end-member processes in terms of what is going on, mostly in these alpine cleft environments. But like I said, we see them elsewhere. But ultimately, it's an end-member process. And it's the result of optimal alignments of these geologic processes. I mean, we do find Fadens. I mean, like I said, they're relatively more widespread than we first realized, but we don't form them everywhere. You don't form them in pegmatites, for example. I've never, ever heard of a Faden coming out of a pegmatite. So there is an optimal alignment of geologic processes, which leads to the formation of this beautiful crystal that we're observing. Like I said, they are widespread geographically, so we know that it's not just an isolated occurrence. And yeah, like I kind of already mentioned, there is a certain level of geological constraints. You can't just form these in a shale out in the middle of nowhere. That would just be goofy. The observation that we also see these in, kind of like I mentioned before, not just in quartz, but in apatite and epidote, et cetera. It again says that this is a relatively common geologic process. And if you meet a certain set of criteria under, this set of geologic conditions, you could potentially form a Faden. And then the last note that I'd like to point out here is that, Faden localities, they don't exclusively produce Fadens. They actually produce, like I said, absolutely gem minerals of all other kinds. But as an example, so this is the one picture that I have in here that's not in the case. This is an absolutely killer philapatite from Alchuri. From the Eugene and Sharon Cisneros collection, but it's not a Faden. I mean, it's an absolutely beautiful alpine cleft style tabular apatite, but it's not a Faden. And you see that for all these other species. And so again, I would say that we should, if we're going to continue to try to understand Fadens and try to figure out their exact processes, we have to what we have to come at it from a process-driven perspective. And so with that, I've started collecting material to try to look at things in more detail. And if anybody wants to send me stuff, that's my email. To be clear, I don't want your good stuff because I'm going to cut it. But cathodoluminescence has come a long way since, well, in the past even 10 years. And there's a lot of work that's been done to pull apart various generations of quartz and tie them to different events and so on and so forth. Also, fluid inclusions would be, a big part of this as well. But with that, thank you for your time and happy to answer any questions. Yeah, Bruce. I have not, no. And that's actually something that Pete mentions in his MinRec article in 1990 is that, if this was, I think one of the original proposals was that this is like an epigenetic process where the Faden itself, when actually, kind of his hypothesis that the Faden itself is the nucleus, then you at some point should see multiple Fadens if those are the nucleation points. I have not seen that. And I've not heard of anybody else who has observed that as well. So, yeah. Oh. Yeah. Say that again. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Just one. So differentiation isn't the end product fits. Not sure I understand that final part of your question. Moving single episode, one plot. Right. If it were propagated over a long time, wouldn't you expect Reggie first parallel lines, the dotted lines, and then the destruction of the original plot? Yeah, sure. Yeah, I could see that. Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. Something to. No, yeah.
Isn't it kind of episodic that the Faden just grows slowly over time with episodes of?
Well, yeah. So it's. I guess maybe I.
That's kind of suggested if you had a photo earlier that it looked like these rows of fluid inclusions that maybe represented breakage of the Faden, that micro breakage that occurs periodically over time.
Yes, yeah. I guess I should clarify. Most, at least as far as I am aware, most people don't think that the initial Faden growing as a fiber. I don't think most people think that's the correct hypothesis. It is more like you start forming this and then you break and then you reheal and so on and so forth. Now, as to why that would only form a single line as opposed to a series of parallel lines, I'm not sure. You do find, there are some cases where you have the Faden line and then you have, as the crystal progresses, you can see like how other fluid inclusions were trapped as almost perpendicular to that. But those, they don't span the length of the crystal either, whereas Fadens, kind of one of the definitions of it is it's going to span the length of the crystal because it's forming along the entire length of the crystal. But like I said, why you don't form multiple parallel lines in the same crystal, that is an excellent question. I don't know.
All right, we have time for one more question. I think Ed put his hand up.
If they have, I'm not terribly aware of it. I'm sure someone's tried to take a look at it, but I'm not sure. Not as far as I can see. But that would be a relatively simple task. You can already see where it is, so you just that's a kind of a no-brainer. But yeah, not in a systematic way as far as I know. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Caleb.
Thanks, y'all.